Welcome. I just want to take the opportunity, since this is my first opportunity at the conference, to welcome you all as a group. Really appreciate it. So excited to have you here. Each year when we do the Clean Energy Conference, the thing that really gets me the most excited is to be able to see you all, the online learners of our Financing and Deploying Clean Energy program, and now our new certificate program in Clean and Equitable Energy Development. To have you all in person, and it's really great to not only have myself, have the two of us talk to each other, but to see you all engage with each other in person. And I think there's a special privilege that the current cohort of FDCE and the Clean Equitable Energy Development Program folks who are currently in the program, you get to then engage with one another in the live sessions, having met each other in person. So I think that's a really special moment for you all too. So thank you for being here. I did want to point out there are additional events that are focused for you all. After this session, we're going to be taking a group photo, so I hope that your smiles are ready and you can brush up on your hair and everything. We'll have a really nice picture together. And then this evening, we have a special a dinner over in the Peabody Museum. So it's been under construction renovation for a couple of years, so we're really delighted to be able to welcome you all into that space tonight. So we'll have a bit of a reception from 6 to 6:30, and then food will be served and at 6:30. So please do. That's just across the street. So I look forward to seeing you all there. Okay, so without further ado, I'll keep this short. Introducing Charles Hua, who is here to share with us some really interesting insights on the work that he's doing right now. I think one thing that I've learned from looking at his career trajectory is to think big and then just start taking the steps towards that big goal. For example, some of his early work was petitioning for his school district, which was the school district to go 100% renewable. Is that correct? And it was the biggest district in the U.S. to undergo that. So, just think big, get started. And one of his specialties really is to think strategically on policy design that's going to enable grid modernization, and so really to help us achieve our goals of supplying clean energy and accelerating our equitable energy transition. So really delighted to have Charles share his work with us today. And then we have a question and answer session. So as he's speaking, I hope those wheels are turning in your mind and that you feel comfortable to raise your hand and ask questions. So without further ado, thank you so much, Charles, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I feel obligated to say, because we're in enemy territory, that I went to that school.
I didn't mention that
up the Northeast corridor. So no, but it's a pleasure to be here. This is a prettier campus, I will say. So before we start, I was told that the link to the Volts podcast episode was shared as homework. So we're going to start with a quiz to see who actually. No, I'm kidding. So how many PUC commissions are appointed? I'm just joking. What would be helpful is just to get a sense of who's in the room. So does anybody actually work for a PUC or a PUC adjacent, or worked for a PUC before? All right, so we got at least one. So I know who not to call on for Q&A. No. How about for a clean energy developer? Okay, good number. Government agency besides a PUC? Okay. What am I missing here? Academics, students, a lot of folks. Corporates or investors? Okay. So we've got a really diverse mix. I think by the end of this discussion, one of the objectives is to really illustrate just how vital all of y'all's perspectives are to this conversation around modernizing our utility regulatory system, and why each of the different stakeholders represented both in this room today and also broadly as part of the energy sector need to engage in our utility regulatory bodies. So I titled this talk, so I'm going to speak for about half an hour and really want to save the rest of the time for Q&A. But I titled this talk Under Pressure, Balancing the Three-Legged Stool of an Affordable, Reliable, and Clean U.S. Energy Transition. The grid is very much under pressure. And we're going to talk a little bit about just for the different stakeholders that are, again, represented in this room, what are the set of challenges and constraints that we're facing? And by extension, what are the opportunities that we have to make progress on not only our decarbonization targets, but our equity and energy justice targets and objectives, as well as making sure that we can still have an affordable and reliable electric system. So I've split this presentation up into three parts. There's really three key take-home messages that I want everybody in this room to walk away with. The first is simply that we are living through the most dynamic period in the history of the U.S. electricity system right now. This is the most exciting time to work in energy and electricity. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. And I don't think it's quite possible to understate that. Right, so this is a picture, I think, that's emblematic of a lot of what is going on right now. So the talk of the town these days is load growth, right? I think everybody in this room is probably aware that the rate of electricity demand is increasing the fastest rate in a couple decades. That's both a challenge, because we need to figure out how we can build enough generation resources to be able to serve that load. But it's also an opportunity for us to figure out how we can accelerate deployment of things like geothermal and nuclear, advanced clean firm technologies, where we have this need for more reliable electric generation. It's an opportunity for us, if we do this right, to expand the base of energy consumers such that we can spread these fixed costs across a larger base of customers. And in theory, reduce energy bills if we can build the transmission and distribution infrastructure to be able to connect utility scale and distributed energy resources. But we have to do this right. There's a very narrow range of solutions that we can really pursue that most energy experts say would be smart or strategic. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is, right? But things that you all are already familiar with: energy efficiency, demand response, virtual power plants, distributed energy resources, utility scale solar, rooftop solar, wind, and then our fun geothermal, nuclear, long duration energy storage, and other technologies. So there's, when I say we're at the most important or exciting or dynamic period in the US electricity system, what do I really mean? Like, why is that the case right now? Right now, here in October 2024, why is that the case? Well, there's really 5 factors that I would point to. So first and foremost, it's this load growth trend driven by artificial intelligence and manufacturing in the near term. And in the medium to long term, things like electric vehicle adoption, building electrification, industrial electrification, and all the other different end uses of electricity that we have. A second is federal and state policy tailwinds, right? We have obviously the Inflation Reduction Act, but at the state level, just in the last 5 years, there's been a proliferation of states that have adopted 100% clean electricity standards. Just last year, we saw in Minnesota and Michigan, those 2 states joined the crowd. And now, believe it or not, over half of Americans live in a state that has committed to 100% clean electricity, which is very exciting, right? So we have both federal and state policy tailwinds, and even with policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, there's strong reason to believe that those policies have durability, which is something that we haven't been able to take for granted. Third is an obvious one, which is technological innovation, right? Declining costs of both utility scale and distributed energy resources. And just on that latter point, we've been talking about sort of this prosumer approach to energy for a long time, but we're really now starting to live it, right? The idea that you can both be an energy producer and consumer is something that, you would hear Jigger talk about on Energy Gang in the mid 2010s, but now, virtual power plants are the talk of the town. This idea that we can flex demand, that we can use our existing resources more efficiently, that as residential energy customers, you actually have an opportunity to self-generate your electricity through rooftop solar, store it through either an EV or residential storage system. It's very exciting. And then we can aggregate all those resources as well into wholesale markets as part of FERC Order 2022. Or even in vertically integrated markets, there are some utilities that are looking at innovative ways, like in Vermont with Green Mountain Power, how we can get more residential storage in the system that actually saves money relative to the alternative, which is building a bunch of new transmission and distribution infrastructure. So that's very exciting. The fourth trend that we're facing, though, is less exciting, but it's an important one, which is regulatory bottlenecks. Almost all the buzzwords that you hear now, permitting reform, interconnection queues, even load growth, transmission build-out, those are all regulatory issues. Those are all symptoms of an outdated regulatory system that was built, designed in the early 1900s, over a century ago, that served a purpose then, but doesn't quite serve the purpose now, which is, yes, expand our grid infrastructure, but also let's do it in a way that makes sure that we are efficient about it. Because we don't need to just build the grid that we have now from scratch. We do need to expand it, we need to triple it, but there's also more that we can unlock out of our existing grid. So if you just think about how much work it took us to go from the invention of electricity to the grid that we have now, why would we not make the most out of it? Why would we not deploy grid-enhancing technologies, advanced conductors, and other solutions that we have available that can unlock more effective transmission and distribution capacity out of our existing system? Why would we not do that? Right? We worked so hard to get to this point. And at the same time, let's still build out new interregional transmission infrastructure in particular. Let's scale, utility scale, clean energy resources. Let's do all of that. But we have to do it in a smart way. Because if we don't, then we're not going to deliver on affordability, reliability, plus sustainability. And then just to that last point, which I'll touch on, the kind of 2 or 3, depending on how you define it, bedrock principles of our utility regulatory system, affordability, reliability, and let's say safety, those are being called into question in every state, right? Every state is facing either 1 or 2 of those challenges. There's no state that has it, totally clean right now. California's electricity bills have skyrocketed in recent years, in part due to factors outside of its control, wildfire risks, in part due to things that it altruistically did for the rest of the country and world, which is deploy a lot of clean energy, expand infrastructure build out that made it cheaper for everybody else, but aren't exactly internalized in their structure. But also things in their control, right? Like, there's, for folks that are really needed in the California NEM conversations, the net metering conversations, as well as the income graduated fixed charge conversations, this is a really contentious point. To the point where the California Public Utilities Commission is becoming increasingly a household name. Not for the right reasons, but for reasons. On the reliability piece, look at what's happening in Houston, right? Just this year. I have friends who live in Houston with power outages for over a week. Right? And we'll talk about that in a second. I have a visual, so I'll actually spare that for now. But the point being that these bedrock principles that we took for granted and could take for granted, we can turn turn on our lights anytime we wanted to, and that the bill at the end of the month would be affordable, we can't take for granted anymore in any state. And so there's these 5 factors that are really contributing to this uniquely exciting moment for the electricity system in the US. And we need to recognize that the stuff that we do now has critical implications for our electric system 3 decades from now. And that's why it's so important that everybody in this room is at minimum thinking about these issues, if not working on these issues. So let's get into that a little bit. So here's the slide of kind of on the residential side, the potential that we have here with virtual power plants. So what's the context that we're in now, right? Like, okay, get it, those are our 5 dynamics, right? Let's dive in a little bit deeper. So first, we're not on track actually to meet our clean energy targets. I first found this when I saw a tweet from Brian D saying, this chart keeps me up at night. Right? Look at the yellow, that's the historic pace of clean energy deployment. It's certainly increased. But relative to what analysts expected post-IRA deployment to look like, we are not there, in part due to those regulatory bottlenecks that we were talking about just now. And then I don't have this on this chart, but if you map out what's needed for, let's say, a 1.5 scenario, we're certainly not on track for that, right? This is just looking at what, in theory, the IRA was able to do. And we still have a long gap to go. Meanwhile, as part of this load growth conversation, utilities are aiming to build significant new gas, which would put U.S. climate goals out of reach, and by extension, the world's climate goals. Other countries looking to what the U.S. is doing around power sector decarbonization to inform their own approaches. Right? If the U.S. is deferring and defaulting to building a bunch of gas, why would a country with less energy infrastructure not also build cheaper forms of generation, even if it's worse from a climate standpoint? Right, so just 5 utilities in Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Virginia, and North Carolina are proposing nearly 25,000 megawatts of new gas build-out. This actually doesn't even reflect forthcoming IRPs in the next year or 2 years from some of these utilities. So I think everybody knows what an IRP is, but just to make that explicit, integrated resource planning, which is essentially, only 30 states actually have it, but it's a process by which utilities develop their investment plans and have them reviewed by regulators to make sure that those proposed investments, based on their forecasted increase in electricity demand, how those resources can fulfill that demand. And just on that note, not every state that has an IRP process actually allows their PUC to approve or reject those plans. So there's about a half dozen states where the PUC, all they can do is say, we have acknowledged or we haven't acknowledged your integrated resource plan. There's no legal authority around the plan itself, right? So there are these surgical tweaks that we need to examine systematically across states to figure out how is our utility regulatory system outdated, and what are the simple tweaks that we need to make sure that the regulatory system has the right resources, authority, et cetera, to be able to do its job effectively. Because why go through this whole process where you have hundreds of folks across departments in a utility, forecast load, and have this be, it's a monopoly that's doing this, and not have any sort of legally binding scrutiny from a regulator around this. How is that meant to serve the public interest, right? So that's just an example of how we can improve some of these processes that actually make it better. Meanwhile, we have an affordability crisis, an energy burden and energy justice crisis, where roughly 1 in 3 Americans are struggling to pay their energy bills. So what does that mean? That means that 1 in 3 Americans, over 100 million Americans, are trading off basic food, medical, educational, and other expenses just to pay their electricity bill, right? And this isn't something that you can just not pay. And so there's a huge affordability crisis here. And this is only going to get worse if we don't think strategically about how we can combat those issues. And of course, both those impacts that I just said, both the fossil generation / lack of clean energy deployment, as well as this energy burden, energy injustice issue, disproportionately impact low-income communities, communities of color, environmental justice communities, rural communities, and a lot of other communities that have historically been left behind with the clean energy transition. But I think with the Inflation Reduction Act, with Justice 40, with the efforts, I know there's some DOE folks in the room, there has been very much more concerted effort to make sure that they're not just beneficiaries of these policies, but are actually central to the development, design, and implementation of them, which is exciting. Doesn't mean that the work is done, but it's progress relative to how these conversations have looked in the past. This is the chart that I was trying to say. So this is Houston. Why do I have a picture of Whataburgers on the right? Well, this is people's way of figuring out where there's power in the state. I'm sure many of you are familiar with those tweets. I think it's interesting, right? It says a couple things. One is just there is a data information gap here during periods of crisis where people need to know when their power is going to turn back on. And the fact that this became so viral in some sense, I think is a very poor reflection of the state of our regulatory system, the state of our utility-customer relationship. But the broader point is that, again, those bedrock principles, reliability and affordability, are being called into question in a way that hasn't been in the past to this degree. And then, I think it's fair to say that the energy regulatory system historically has been ground zero for climate inaction and environmental injustice in America for far too long. Often how that's manifested is regulatory bodies that have approved fossil fuel projects. Here are just some examples, not meant to pick on any particular public utility commissions, more so just to illustrate this trend. And also, just from an affordability standpoint, continuous rate hikes. We would argue I think it's fair to argue with insufficient scrutiny with the residential ratepayers' interests central in mind. So the second key message is that if you care about the energy transition, you need to care about state public utility commissions, state PUCs. I was very glad. I promise I didn't talk to Ali beforehand yesterday to say PUCs, I think 2 or 3 times during his talk. But everybody needs to care about state public utility commissions. Let me make the case why. So PUCs, every state has one. They are important regulators of all sorts of utilities, right? Of course, folks in this crowd, electricity and gas are most relevant, but they also regulate water utilities, telecommunications companies, sometimes rail safety. They regulate a lot. They primarily regulate the investor-owned utilities, although the exact authority depends on the state. So sometimes they may have regulatory jurisdiction over, for instance, how a rural electric co-op procures certain resources or cites certain resources. But for all intents and purposes for our discussion today, we're just focused on the investor-owned utilities, which represent about 2/3 to 3/4 of American energy consumption, depending on how you define that. So they have the power to determine 3 things in particular that I think are really important and relevant. First is our energy bills. Second is how much utilities invest in different forms of energy and all of the sub-questions therein, like how are utilities incorporating the IRA into their integrated resource plans? Spoiler alert, not well. I was working with, have been working, I should say, with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab on a report that's looking at this topic. That will be released later. And there's significant delta between what utilities can do around IRA uptake and what they have. So take something, I mentioned DOE, right? Take something like the 1706 and 1703 program, which basically allows utilities to take advantage of low-cost financing from the government to refinance, repurpose, retool, et cetera, rebuild, et cetera, fossil fuel infrastructure, particularly for clean energy deployment. They're not doing that consistently, and certainly are not explicitly incorporating those into their integrated resource plans enough, right? So there's a bunch of sub-questions to that that are really important, in addition to reviewing things like, utility resource procurement, things like granting utilities CPCN, certificates of public convenience and necessity, to build new projects, et cetera. And then lastly, where energy projects are located. So again, the authority differs by the state, but some public utility commissions have transmission siting authority. In most states, PUCs have some role over that. Some states entirely outsource it to a external advisory board or through some offshoot of the state's energy office. There are different models depending on the state. Sometimes there's a grid modernization advisory council. Really depends on the state. But broadly speaking, PUCs have authority over these three things. That means that the 200 public utility commissioners in this country, they oversee over $200 billion each year in utility spending. So this is just CapEx, so I'm not even showing OpEx that they have authority to review. Just on CapEx, you can see here, there's substantial regulatory oversight. So that's $1 billion a person, yet raise your hand if you can name all of the public utility commissioners in your home state. Okay, so we do have a bunch of nerds in this crowd, but not enough. So, after this, go look up your home state's Public Utilities Commission, figure out who are the 3 or 5 or 7 people in 40 states appointed, 10 states elected, that serve 4 to 6 year terms usually, that have the authority over all of those things that we just talked about. Right? $1 billion a commissioner. We should be talking about them like they're Supreme Court justices, at least in our niche industry, which is not niche, I should say, our industry. Right? We should be talking about them like they're Supreme Court justices. And what does that mean? That means that anytime there's an opportunity, there's an opening, there's a new commission seat, we should be paying attention to and making sure that the governor that's appointing them is centering these principles that we're talking about in their decision. So, PUCs, I think, at the same time, I think it's really crucial to bring some level of empathy and nuance to the understanding of the role. Right? I think it's easy to bash utilities, it's easy to bash PUCs. We prefer to bash the regulatory system. But PUCs are under-resourced, understaffed, not exactly prestigious relative to a place like Yale. Outdated, underperforming, but I think there are very real structural constraints that are really crucial to call out. So one, just on the funding piece, right? To give you an example, on the left, and I recognize it's not exactly apples to apples, but just to give a sense of scale, the North Carolina PUC's budget is around $11 million. Duke, which operates in North Carolina, the annual operating revenues are about $29 billion, right? So that's like a 2,500 to 1 ratio. How can you expect the North Carolina PUC to be able to fully, dive into tens of thousands of pages of docket filings and understand exactly all the assumptions that the utility, which is outgunning them again by 2,500 to 1, to understand how they're making certain assumptions about their load forecast, how they're making certain assumptions about the LCOE for utility scale solar in 2030. How can we expect that, right? So we need to, there's a lot of things that we need to do, including increasing the budget, so figuring out state by state how we do that. Every state is different. Sometimes it's a levy on utility ratepayers, right? And I think that's a strategic investment still. It would still generate a substantial return for ratepayers, similar to the IRS, where increased IRS capacity can actually yield substantial increased revenue for the agency. Some cases it's building a talent pipeline. We with Powerlines are particularly excited to build academic partnerships for a couple reasons. One is to expand the knowledge base of these issues. The second really is to motivate a generation of students and scholars and faculty to really engage more on utility regulatory issues and topics, right? So, but we would love it if, every Yale student decided to work for their home state's PUC or FERC, right? That's a good thing if we can build that pipeline. The last kind of take-home message here is that everybody has a critical role to play in modernizing our utility regulatory system. So, actually, before I go there, we haven't spent as much time talking about what are some policy reforms that are on the table that we could do. We talked a little bit about integrated resource planning, right? So this is kind of just like anybody as an advocate or whether you're a stakeholder that's more intensively involved in the process can push for some of these things. But the policy reforms that we're talking about include things like reforming and modernizing integrated resource planning to require utilities to consider energy efficiency, demand-side resources, virtual power plants first as part of the candidate solution mix, or at all. In some cases, they're not even at all allowed or empowered to do that. Consider transmission as a resource, have the IRP be aligned to the state's decarbonization and equity objectives, especially if the state has a 100% clean electricity standard. And also give the PUC authority to approve or reject those plans. So we've done a lot of landscape analysis and mapping to figure out for all of those things that I just said, which states have what of them, and very few states have the gold standard, all of those pieces, right? So the idea here is like, how do we push, for instance, different states to ramp up those surgical tweaks that seem very small, but actually individually and certainly in the aggregate can amount to substantial improvements to the way that we plan for all of this whole energy transition. So that's one. On the distributed side, more states are looking at integrated distribution system planning. So how can we get more state legislators to view this as a priority to make sure that utilities conduct, develop hosting capacity maps to figure out where we can safely and reliably interconnect new resources on the distribution system. It's things like getting states to look at gas transition plans. So only about 10 states have future gas dockets. But this is just planning. It's just saying let's plan for what the future of the gas system looks like, right? These things seem basic, but how can we actually do anything if we don't even do the basic things like planning? So that's one kind of component. There are other components, I think we're in Connecticut right now, which has one of the most well-known PUC commissioners in the country, Chair Marissa Gillette. Connecticut is undergoing really innovative work around performance-based regulation. So changing the way that utilities are compensated from the traditional mode, which is called cost of service regulation, COSR, which is utilities make money based off how much they spend, particularly on CapEx, and not on how well they perform, right? So modernizing those incentive structures. Things like rate design reform. So how do we change rate structures to better serve low-income customers? How do we change rate structures so that we can incentivize electrification by pushing down the marginal costs of rates of electricity, while still making sure that efficiency is incentivized. So taking California out of the picture, because California is in a very unique situation, there's still a possibility to delicately balance those different objectives in many other states. So figuring out rate design reform. And then, there's a whole suite of other policies, and certainly happy to talk more with anybody after, and would very much welcome any ideas from folks around state-level policy reforms that we should really engage in to modernize our utility regulatory system. But things like expanding low-income bill assistance programs to make sure that those that are paying upwards of 10% of their income on their utility bills, for instance, can actually properly manage this transition, especially if we are going to really ramp up our transmission and grid upgrade investments over the next several years. And there's other policies like that as well. Intervenor compensation is one that I didn't mention, which is supplying advocates with the financial resources to participate in PUC proceedings. So also looking at some of those institutional and infrastructure reforms to the process by which people engage so that more folks are involved. So there's really three things that I think I'd call out for particular areas to focus on. When we talk about modernizing utility regulation, what are the three things that you should key in on? So it's 3 P's: people, policy, process. Right? Just on the first, the 200 PUC commissioners, again, most of them are appointed, some of them are elected. You're going to go after this hour, before lunch, you're going to go look up your home state's Public Utility Commission, figure out who's on there. Again, we need to make sure that there's a limited number of slots, essentially. If it is your worldview that that what we do in the energy system over the next 3 to 5 years will make or break whether we can actually hit our decarbonization targets in this country, which I have the worldview. I think many also share the worldview. There really aren't that many slots available. There really aren't that many opportunities to engage in this process, especially if you're talking about within just your home state. So you really need to figure out when terms end, when there are opportunities to engage in that process, and make sure that, again, the key decision makers are adequately centering public interest. I've spoken to governors and asked them about how they make their PUC appointments, and you get different reactions. Some of them know what public utility commissions are, which is good. I was very impressed with Governor Walz's response. He actually is very thoughtful on some of this stuff. But it really depends. Because this stuff is not exactly salient. It is changing, though, because of all those affordability, reliability challenges that I mentioned. But you care about this stuff. So at minimum, governors should be hearing from everybody in this room about their appointments. Because there are different ways of approaching this. Connecticut, Governor Lamont reappointed Chairwoman Gillette. Kentucky, Governor Beshear did not reappoint Ken Chandler, who many consider the most consumer-centric commissioner in the state for decades. Right. So there's different fates here, but it's not exactly out of folks' control entirely. So the second is policy. We just touched on that just now. So looking at what state legislators and federal legislators can do around a lot of those planning, programmatic, and process reforms to engaging in utility regulation. And then lastly, so just on the process piece, expanding the set of folks that are involved in these PUC proceedings. So historically, we've taken a very inside baseball approach to utility regulatory processes. So it's a lot of formal intervention, technical proceedings, and live dockets. There hasn't really been an effort, I would say, systematically at scale to expand that process so that a wider swath of stakeholders is represented. Let me just shed some light on who's missing from that process. Certainly the public, I think we all know that PUCs aren't exactly flooded with members of the public, but they're also not flooded with Fortune 500 companies. If you take away the big tech companies and Walmart, there really aren't many companies that are engaged in PUCs at scale. Even companies who have low margins and energy bills are a material share of their expenses. Right? So they, especially if they have 100% clean energy targets, should be engaged in these PUC proceedings. Certainly environmental justice and energy justice burdened communities have been left out of the process for far too long. There are a lot of stakeholders that are not active, that I think we would argue should be active, and if they were to be activated to participate, would lead to material differences in outcomes in PUC decisions, for instance. Let me share a story real quick about what's possible here. Does anybody know who these two people are? Guy on the left, his name is Devontae Lewis, early 30s, one of the youngest PUC commissioners in the country. He's Louisiana's first statewide elected official who is LGBTQ. He's very much in favor of utility accountability and climate justice. Guy on the right, Craig Green, orthopedic surgeon because Louisiana PSC is part-time, actually. So he's an orthopedic surgeon as his day job. Former LSU football player, son of an influential state senator, moderate Republican, pro-market guy. They have a lot in common. No, they actually do. So they work together to get energy efficiency rules in Louisiana passed for the first time since it was first proposed 15 years ago. Something as basic and common sense as energy efficiency took 15 years to get across the finish line. But it did. It happened. Right? And so now Entergy is required to have a third-party administrator to run an energy efficiency program for Louisiana residents. Common sense things that are going to provide immediate relief to Louisiana households that are already among the most energy burden in the country with old housing stock that isn't energy efficient. Just taking Devontae real quick, in 2022, he actually lost the general election after Louisiana gets elected. He lost the general election 43 to 18%. But because the incumbent didn't clear 50, there was a runoff. So in December 2022, Devontae won 59-41. So he went from being down 25 to winning by 18. How did that happen? Well, the Louisiana Public Service Commission in December 2022, that was the only election in America. So you had guys like Mark Ruffalo tweeting about the Louisiana Public Service Commission race, right? And he won against the odds. And he's very much taken a different mindset and approach to that particular seat in Louisiana. This is what's possible when people pay attention to these very obscure bodies that have a critical role over people's lives. But this can't just be something that we do only because that's the only election going on at the time. This is something that we need to do for all 200 commissioners in the country and making sure that they're well-resourced through budgets, through talent, through resources, through staff, to make sure that they can do their jobs effectively. So I think I'll close with this. So first Powerlines, right? What is Powerlines trying to do about all this? Well, you can listen to the Volts podcast. Hopefully you already have. But scan the QR code to find out more about Powerlines. But essentially what we are is we're a new nonprofit organization. We actually just officially launched publicly last month that's focused on a lot of the things that we talked about just now. So the people involved in this whole utility regulatory system have to make sure that they are adequately centering the public interest in their decisions and well-resourced to do so. How do we have the right policies in place, some of the ones that we talked about, and how do we have the right process in place so that different stakeholders that need to be part of the conversation are actively involved in PUC proceedings. So, and would certainly love to have conversations with folks, with anybody interested in learning more after this to figure out how we can work together, because we are going to need everybody in this room, seriously. I think I'll close with kind of a light note, which is, so we've been kind of going on a Powerlines launch tour, if you will, LA Climate Week, New York Climate Week. It's called the Making Utility Regulation Sexy Tour. So we're going to close with the 5 love languages of utility regulation. This will hopefully be a helpful way to remember how you can be involved. So, quality time. Spend quality time at public utilities commissions. Again, in your home state, anybody can show up in most cases. You can also spend quality time on the YouTube live streams. I watched like 25 hours of the Georgia Power IRP. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. There's a lot of drama. Words of affirmation. If you think your commissioner is doing a good job, thank them. If you don't, then don't. But give them words of affirmation. Acts of service. They're called public service commissions in some states. because they're meant to serve the public. Just by engaging this process and all the things that we talked about, especially for a lot of folks in this room that are very intensively engaged, you're already doing that, but get other folks as well to engage in this process. Maybe even work for a Public Utilities Commission as a commissioner or staff. Physical touch is a little hard. Thankfully, we don't have any Public Utilities Commissioners in the room or staff. It's a little hard, but one thing that you can do is take out your energy bills and really carefully look at it. How many people have spent more than 5 minutes looking at their utility bill and thinking about what's on there? Again, this is a room of nerds.
It was an assignment. Yeah.
It's an assignment? Well, then who was not raising their hand? So that's physical touch. Gift giving. So I felt bad about this. You will see on the page that there is an option to donate to Powerlines. That's not the point. But there are a lot of tireless advocates in every state that have been doing work at public utility commissions and have been engaged in the process. There's at least one person out there. There's somebody, some random citizen who's been tweeting about some obscure rate case for a particular gas utility that you've never heard of in that state. Those people exist, right? And have largely been bootstrapping a lot of their work. So find out who those folks are and figure out how they can be better supported and resourced in the process. So I will stop there and happy to take any questions that anybody has about any of this. Very excited for this Q&A session.
We've only got about 7 minutes.
That's fine. Sorry I went over.
I may have come in a little late, I may have missed it, but in essence, there are red utility companies and blue utility companies. I mean, we have a deregulated and regulated system. All of the gas was being added, I think, in regulated states, right? So basically political red utility commissions that seem to be owned in many cases by the needs of the local regional utility companies. How do we deal with that? I mean, it seems like there's a political level here, which maybe you're not allowed to talk about or whatever. I mean, the flip side here is in Connecticut, where we have a very progressive board, utility companies just stonewall everything. With all due respect to anybody from the utility companies here. I mean, it's very hard to get them to do things that are truly in the state's best interest. There's a real battle, it seems to be going on. So, just wondering, how do we deal with that politically? I mean, are you powerful enough? I mean, is your effort a political effort, or just trying to get more people involved? And I apologize for a big question.
So just to answer that last question, it's all of the above. There's different angles that we need to approach this, but this is a political issue. I think we have called that out explicitly, and it is true that in many/most states, the single most powerful political actor at the state level is the utility companies. That's just a fact. Right? And there is empirical research on this as well to back that up. So yes, you do need to take a political lens to this problem. It doesn't mean capital P in all cases, but even a lowercase p understanding the power structures and the power mapping and who's at play. I think just showing that piece about the budgets, right? It's not just the sheer people power, but it's also the information power, right? When the utility has all the information, even the PUC doesn't have full, let alone the advocates, where a lot of that data is, confidential, right? So yes, I would say, it's not so much that utilities are red or blue, although certainly sometimes state commissions are, especially if they're elected. But it's more so, it's more the kind of cross-cutting power structure that isn't, that transcends the sort of partisan nature of it. It's just who can they influence, right? Who can folks influence? So, but that's actually what's very exciting in our view about the possibilities around utility regulatory modernization efforts, is that it is not partisan. That's why I specifically called out this example, where these are common sense things, and because of that first section of this talk, which was that this is the most exciting and important inflection point in the history of the US electricity system, people across the board are open-minded to figure out what are creative solutions to address those challenges. Because the things that we took for granted, we can no longer take for granted, and we need new approaches. So we are, in many ways, trying to build a big tech coalition that includes folks from all different political stripes. Okay, a lot of questions. How about we take like 3 and I'm going to try to combine them. Yeah, you first.
Thank you. Great talk. So I'm an attorney for a utility company and stuff, but I don't do the regulatory stuff, so I don't have the ordinary antagonistic relationship with PUCs that most attorneys do have.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. What does the ideal sort of legal authority for a PUC look like to you? I mean, there are PUCs that don't have the ability to reject an IRP. There are some that do. You know, is there a way of sort of over empowering them? What balance do you think strikes the most sense in terms of the legal authority of a PUC and what they can do to help shape the energy market in that state?
Great question. Yeah, you.
Another lawyer, so glad to find my brother in here, although I was a regulator for the state of Maryland. So anyway,
Let's see you raise your hand.
just a quick question about where you see the best returns for things like rate design, because every interaction I've had with power companies, they've been completely agnostic on rate design. They care about, cost of capital. They care about, getting everything in revenue requirements. So I was just curious where rate design you see the biggest wins, because I feel like that would have the least pushback.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, to put the lawyering questions in a little context, year on year, as you probably know, Charles, since the past 2 decades, about a running 10% of all new federal securities fraud actions have been against utilities, as well as and/or folks that trade electricity or gas. I count 10 law schools on that Powerlines website. Tell us about, you gave us a milk toast. I love the end with the love stuff. You gave us a milk toast offering. What's the litigation strategy here? Or are those 10 law schools on your website there for show and tell or some other?
So you want me to do this in front of the lawyers?
Well, I want the real stuff here. Because you know that data that I just gave you.
Maybe I should just keep asking questions until we run out of time. Let me try to tackle this. First, I think it's a very important question. We need to figure that out. There are possible ways that PUCs have too much, there's too much regulatory burden. I don't think that there's a real risk of that in any state right now. Even in this state. I don't think so. Your question was on rate design. It is true. I think utilities just care about recovering those costs. Doesn't matter how. I think they're a little bit concerned, though, that there would be consumer pushback from the risk that they would have to pay more. Right? So part of that is a framing question. It's like if you say, you might have to pay more during peak periods, like with Lyft or Uber, that's one way of messaging. Another way is like actually you can save money if you use less electricity during this time. There are ways of messaging this. I don't think that there's enough of a trust relationship between utilities and customers, though, right now. That's why we're not seeing more states go to default time of use rates, even though that's by far the most economically, environmentally, and from an equity standpoint, arguably efficient way of doing this. So we need to create the right, I think, coalitions to make that possible, which does include the buy-in from utilities and customers. I'm going to skip your question.
A little bit of a follow-up on the political question. Have you seen, other than the collaborative example that you showed, have you seen any strategies that have actually worked in red states?
Yeah. Louisiana is a red state. I think Arkansas has had good commissioners in the past. One of the former Republican commissioners on our advisory board, Ted Thomas. There are several other states. I'm trying to think, but there are several other states. I do think that we are at time. I don't want to take us past time, but I'm here. I'm happy to answer any further questions. Just want to say thanks for having me. I'm very excited to keep the conversation going, and I'll leave my contact information there and look forward to talking more.